Hi everyone, this is Dr. Westfall, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the micro reasoning tasks that are going to be in our class this semester. These are tasks that are designed to get you thinking about the claims that papers make or the claims that you might want to make in the papers and in the writing that you produce for this class. One of the things I see very often is that people judge the value of a claim not on the evidence, which is what we should be judging it on if we are treating our academic pursuits as a science and not as an art. And they're judging it just on what sounds good and what they think would pass in terms of something they'd read in a newspaper or something they think they would read on a blog and believe. But here's the problem. Things that are reported in newspapers and blogs, not great sources. Generally, they're designed to get your eyeballs and get your attention. They're not designed to actually inform you. So the goal today is to talk about these tasks that you're going to be doing as part of this class that will help you start to see where something might sound good, but not actually be a valid argument. Okay, so with that in mind, what is a micro reasoning task? Well, it is a fast, low stakes task that I'm asking you to do that asks you to reason through something, to actually look at a piece of evidence and decide if it's a valid claim or a good piece of evidence, or if maybe the claim sounds good, but the evidence isn't quite there. And what I'm hoping to see in your responses, whether they're written responses or if they're video responses, or if we're talking just face to face or over Zoom. What I'm looking to see is not only can you identify is the evidence good evidence, but you can just identify what the evidence is. What is this claim resting on? Because that's obviously the first step. And one of the reasons why these are timed is because while it would be very, very tempting, I do not want you to just throw a statement into ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini and ask it. Because ultimately, when you are presenting information to others, when you are talking to me or talking to your peers, you're not going to have a lot of credit if every single thing they present to you, you say, hold on, let me throw that into an AI real quick and see if it thinks it should believe it or not. They're going to want to know your opinion and want to know if you believe it or not. So if you like using AI, that is great, but that is not what these tasks are for. I need you thinking, quote unquote, on your feet and by yourself to show me that you can do these reasoning tasks. So what is the general plan for these tasks? Well, the first is to read the statement, and we'll go through a couple of statements here in a moment. Figure out what the claim is that the statement is making, figure out what evidence they are using for that claim, and if we can conclude that that claim is supported by that evidence. And the problem I see with a lot of students when they come into this task is that they don't realize that the bigger the claim you make, the more evidence you must have in order to support that claim. That's why when you're reading a journal article, you don't see just one parenthetical citation after a statement. You typically see two or three if it's a very strong statement. If I make the point that every time a student does blank, something else will occur, that's a really strong statement. I've just said every time this is going to happen. I need to have more than just one citation from a blog somewhere that says, yeah, this kind of sort of happens sometimes. So figure out what claim is being made, figure out what evidence they're using, and then figure out if you can conclude based on that evidence that the claim should be trusted. So here are a couple of, I suppose, examples of ways that claims aren't adequately supported. So in our first example here, students today have shorter attention spans because they use TikTok, so lectures should never be longer than 10 minutes. Should a lecture be longer than 10 minutes? Probably not, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The problem with this is, so they're making a claim here that a lecture should never be longer than 10 minutes. What is their evidence? TikTok. Okay, people like TikTok. TikTok's popular. Maybe you use TikTok yourself. But the fact that a platform that has short form videos is popular doesn't mean that long form content isn't useful or isn't valuable. What we're seeing here is a classic correlation causation problem. Just because a lot of people like TikTok doesn't mean that they don't have the attention span for something longer. It doesn't mean that something engaging can't pull their attention in. This turns what is sort of just a trend that you see to a universal rule that this author is using to say, well, because people like TikTok, they're not going to want anything longer than 10 minutes. That might be true, but that isn't the evidence to show that they don't want something more than 10 minutes. Here's another good one. The class average went up after I added weekly quizzes, so weekly quizzes caused better learning. Again, this is correlation confusing causation. Yeah, you made a change, but was that the only change that you made? Were there other things that you can't really, that you don't have documented here? And it's also post hoc reasoning. If the class averages hadn't changed at all, you probably wouldn't even have thought that maybe it was because of the quizzes. So this is armchair quarterbacking. This is, I know the outcome. It's hindsight bias, all of those things wrapped up in one, but it's not a claim. So what you want to do, I'm sorry, my little picture is in front of this. Maybe I'll see if I can move that in editing. You want to actually have some evidence. Just because claims are presented to you in a way that seems compelling, seems to make sense, doesn't mean they actually are. Okay, so here's another set of claims that we can look at. And these aren't so much that there's no evidence, but it's presenting a preference or it's presenting something that sounds polished or a proxy variable as evidence. Again, just like the first set, there's no actual evidence here. So because some students learn better visually, every lesson should include videos and diagrams. That's confusing a preference because we already know, as you will learn a lot in EPY 601, learning styles, this idea that you should teach to someone's preferred learning style, is just wrong. It doesn't actually cause them to have better learning. So in this case, this person is just assuming that the myth of learning styles is true and that everyone knows that if someone likes to learn visually, you should have a visual component in everything. Not necessarily. Very hard to learn certain things visually. Think about trying to learn music visually without ever listening to it. It'd be very difficult to do. There are good and bad ways to teach everything through multiple modalities. But this concept that your preference dictates your ability to learn, that's debunked. We know that's not true. If you've been having to assess that in your students, I apologize. That's not something that any modern educators should have to be doing, because while we know that there are different preferences, a student's preference for how they learn doesn't actually mean they're going to learn better that way. Second statement here, AI generated writing sounds polished, so students who use AI are probably learning more efficiently. There's no reason to believe that. Just because something sounds good doesn't mean it actually means something. I had a grad student one time come up to me and say, I wish I could write the way that this professor writes. It's very dense and it's very academic and rigorous. And I looked down and said, just because you had to reread that 3 times doesn't mean it was good. It just means it was dense. It was hard to read. Sometimes the way that something presents, the way it looks, doesn't make it any more or less valid. So just like our first set of claims, these two don't have any actual evidence to them either. So we shouldn't use them as claims. Okay, so those first 4 claims that we looked at really had no evidence to support them. They sounded good, sounded probably passable for a newspaper article, they sounded probably passable for a blog, but there's no evidence behind them. Now let's look at evidence that's sort of stretched out beyond what it would actually support us saying. Students who take handwritten notes perform better, so laptops should be banned in all classes. We can actually find some evidence that for some students and in some contexts, handwriting notes is actually better for retention and retrieval. But this is not a strong enough piece of evidence that I would tell you that we should say that handwriting is preferable for everyone all the time and that we should avoid taking notes by computer. I took notes on a computer my entire time through undergrad and graduate school and still today, and I remember most things pretty well. Of course, that's also a very little piece of evidence, one person. But the point here is, if you wanted to make the statement, some students who take handwritten notes will have better retrieval, so we should encourage students to explore the ways they take notes to learn what works for them, okay, you can find evidence for that. But by saying, no, every student should be taking notes by hand because it will be better for everyone, the evidence just doesn't support that. You're stretching that evidence way too far. Next one, the teaching strategy is research-based, which will work in any course. Research is limited. Every research paper you read has limitations, delimitations, have these things that say, in the future we need to look at this, we need to look at that. There's no real good universal research that you can say works 100% all the time. In fact, most scientists will tell you that the dirty word in science is prove. We never actually prove anything in science. We add evidence and we take evidence away from the claims that we make. So if you are seeing a statement like that that says the teaching strategy is research based, so use it, maybe not always, but I guarantee you that this is a great buzzword for industry. It's a great buzzword if I want you buying my product to tell you that it's research based. Oh, and if you're keeping track, we're now over the 10-minute mark on this mini lecture. So I apologize for you TikTok fans. You're just having to watch me longer. I know it's rough. All right, so our last set of claims. In the past, we looked at claims that had no evidence, and then the last slide, we looked at evidence that stretched beyond. In this case, we're looking at some very clever wording that, basically makes it sound like there's only one way, because we're not going to give the alternatives, we're not going to give other thoughts. We're going to say, no, it's a forced choice, it has to go this way. If students can Google facts instantly, then memorization is pointless. What? Just because you can get information quickly, there's no cognitive benefit to learning something by memorizing it? No, the memorization, we have a lot of evidence, does do certain things in the brain. It helps build certain skills. So just because you look something up, that doesn't mean that, we don't need other skills. This is sort of akin to saying, well, if I can't do X, then Y, Z, and A, B, C, D, all of those are out the window. No, that's just one particular wrinkle to it. Maybe I teach something a little differently. Maybe I don't rely on memorization for certain things, or maybe I add memorization into other places. But just because students can Google doesn't mean that memorization is completely useless. Since students dislike difficult assignments, those assignments must be bad for motivation. I have given my share of difficult assignments. This assignment in micro critiquing of different claims, it's a difficult assignment. You know what I hear from my students after the difficult assignments? By and large, if they'll still speak to me, they thank me for them because they were able to learn something. They were able to work through something they didn't think they could work through. But the person who writes this, they obviously have a foregone conclusion. Do difficult assignments lower motivation? Maybe in some cases they do. Is that something we can address and work on and try to tweak? Of course it is. Is it evidence that we should just throw out the difficult assignments? No, not at all. But it's written in that way to make it seem like there's only one alternative. Get rid of the difficult assignments. Traditional exams are stressful, so replacing them with projects will make assessment fairer. Ooh, this one sounds like it's a nice way of saying that we're going to be more accessible. We're going to try to limit stress. Well, first of all, it ignores the idea and the reality that stress is part of life. Some things are just stressful. That's a good thing. You want your body to be able to respond to stress. You want your body to be able to deal with different stressful situations. But by and large, what this is doing is it's taking one problem away, the stressful exam, but it's giving something else that might have its own host of problems. There's nothing that says that projects are going to be any less stressful. And any student who's ever worked in a group project and has begged me, could you just give me an exam over this, would probably tell you that one is not better than the other. So all three of these, just like the first four claims that we looked at, they have no evidence with them, really, but they're leading the reader to believe that there's only one path. There's only one thing to do. Get rid of those difficult assignments. Get rid of those exams. Stop memorizing information. None of that's useful. That's a dangerous way to write. And if you are swayed by arguments like that, you need to change the way that you evaluate information. So here is an example of what I would ask you to do. Imagine we had that claim from the first slide. Students today have shorter attention spans because they use TikTok, so lectures should never be longer than 10 minutes. We're like 14 now for if you're keeping track of this one. Okay, plausible part of that is yes, students may be used to shorter media formats. Shorter media formats are available. We can acknowledge that yes, TikTok is a thing. It exists. People like short form video. But the weak link is that we don't show that short form video is actually more impactful on student learning. We don't show that short form video is more engaging and it keeps people's attention. We don't show that short form video has a better retention for knowledge 5 days later, 10 days later than long form video. We also don't show that long form video is itself demotivating or doesn't have as much engagement. We don't have any evidence, really. We just have good argument that maybe sounds plausible. And would it work for a Facebook post? Sure. But we shouldn't be using Facebook post qualifications as our guideline for this class. A better claim? Segmenting lectures, including active checks, doing a bunch of different things and trying to motivate students through those things, there's good evidence that that works, and we can support that. But we can't say that get rid of all the traditional lectures or anything longer than 10 minutes because people just aren't going to be interested in them. So if you were writing on this for the micro critique assignment and you just simply said, hey, there's no evidence that TikTok's length is a better length, would it be a bad idea to consider different lengths and different modalities in different ways? No, that's not a bad idea at all. But we don't have the evidence to specifically say you should never have a lecture longer than 10 minutes. Also, look out for those words like never and always. They'll get you in trouble. And you can use those real quick to point out faulty arguments. This slide sort of gives you the student spotter toolkit. Find the claim, figure out what evidence is there, if there is any. Check the leap. Is the evidence going to actually support the conclusion? Figure out what might be missing. Good idea that's always useful when looking at an argument is think about what evidence you would need to make the counter argument, or what is the counter argument. And if you come to this conclusion where you go, well, there's not good evidence on either side, really, then you're in uncharted territory, and that's fine. That's where we learn, that's where we do research. But we shouldn't sort of believe that the uncharted territory has been charted. And rewrite cautiously. Try to make a claim as narrow as possible. Get rid of those words like always and never. And think about words like likely, seldom, often. Those are words that let the reader know, hey, this isn't a 100% sure thing. This is simply acknowledging that the world is more complex than your Facebook evidence claim. What will the task look like in Canvas that you'll be doing for me? Well, I will give you a claim similar to the ones that we had in this presentation. It will not be exactly the same as any of those. I will give you a short time frame, usually 2 to 5 minutes, depending on the length of the claim, and I'll ask you to write out what your response is. Are there right and wrong answers? There are some degree of right and wrong. Some of the claims are better than others. Some of them might actually be pretty good, so you might struggle to critique them. Others will be really bad. You could drive a truck through them. So don't think that just because it's in this exercise, you are going to be able to drive a truck through all of them. Some of them might be good arguments, and you might just conclude by saying, I don't see anything wrong with that. And once you have sort of written up that, I will then look at it and look at your reasoning, and I will see if you identified the claim, the flaw, a better version of it, and then I will try to give you some feedback on where I think you can improve and try to give you some examples of maybe how to do better. And maybe you're doing fine, and so I don't have to give you that much. But that's the point of these micro critique exercises. They're not to freak you out. They're not to stress you out. They're to start exercising that skill in your brain so that when you start building papers for me, when you start building claims, your writing is sharp enough to actually let me know that you know what you're talking about and that you're not reaching too far. If you have questions, reach out to me. Otherwise, I'm sure all of you will do fine, but I'm happy to chat at any point with you. Just set up a meeting or we can talk during office hours. And I look forward to reading your work this semester.